Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. So first, before I launch into this week's Astro News you can use, today was my mother's birthday, so happy birthday, Mom. First, my usual boring housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. Or you can find it through my Facebook postings or Instagram, where I have a link in my bio. And once you're on that page, you can scroll down. You can hear the most recent show, either live or recorded. And you can search also below that the archived listings for any past shows that you might have missed or which you would like to listen to again. And just a reminder, the show drops every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. And while you're there, if you do go to my website page to access the show, you'll find a free downloadable PDF, which is titled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. This is just basic information that's based on an interview I did with Stephen a couple years ago. And many of you probably know I've mentioned that I have a master certification from Stephen Forrest's apprenticeship program. I'd like to mention too, and I just got wind of this yesterday through Facebook, that Stephen is going to be at Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York this summer. And he's going to be teaching evolutionary astrology there from July 30th through August 4th, which happens to be my brother's birthday. Anyway, I actually signed up for the program, even though I've gone through his entire program. And since I've gone through his program and got the master certification, which was back in January of 2016, he started the Forrest Center for Evolutionary Astrology, which is an online or distance learning program. But I can vouch for the fact that Stephen in person is quite incredible. So if there is anyone out there who would like to take his class, and you realize I'm going to tell you that I'm running a class too in just 2 weeks or 10 days from now. So clearly I'm doing myself a disservice, but Stephen is the real deal. So if anyone, not that I'm not, and I was trained by him, but you know what I'm saying. I just wanted to, on his behalf, make the announcement that he is going to be teaching an evolutionary astrology class, which is pretty much an intensive, at the Omega Institute, again, July 30th through August 4th. And you can go on to either, I'm sure, his website at forrestastrology.com or, look up the Omega Institute, which is in Rhinebeck, New York. And I'm sure you can find out more information and or sign up there. Now, in terms of my program, I will be starting a class called Fate, Free Will, and Your Soul's Karmic Evolution on January 23rd, which is a Monday, and the class will run for 8 weeks, and it will be from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. from, as I said, January 3rd until I think it's March 6th or March 13th. I forget which, but whatever the 8 weeks is. And this is to teach people specifically how to decipher, delineate, and synthesize how the nodes in the chart, which is how we basically structure readings related to evolutionary astrology, which is basically focused on the evolution of the soul. We look at the nodes in the chart, and I'm going to be explaining and teaching how you can use the South Node ruler and the North Node ruler to determine where you came in from past life and or early life karma, depending on your beliefs about reincarnation, and the path, how you might have gotten taken off that path based on squares and other aspects, conjunctions, and oppositions to and from the nodes. So we're going to look at all of those, the rulers of the nodes, aspects to them, the houses by house and also by sign, and I'm going to show you how to weave together a person's past life story and how this is influencing the present life. So again, this class is designed to help people move from chaos to clarity who would like to read astrological charts and gain astrological insight about one's soul's true purpose and mission in this lifetime, what might be blocking this person based on what I call past soul condition, which is patterned behavior that we might want now to become conscious of because it's unconsciously ruled, that we might want to bring into consciousness the fact that we might not have to repeat the past and we have freedom of choice to make different decisions going forward. And how, of course, understanding this allows you to overcome blockages and to become more successful in the major areas of human concern, which are relationships, career, finances, and health. So if you'd like to learn to read your own or others' charts with a focus on how what seemed to be faded from the past can be overcome through free will and choice in the future, then this class is for you. Now, again, it starts on January 23rd. It'll be on Zoom from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, and it'll run for 8 weeks, and recordings will be available. So if you can't make a class, or if you even want to dilly-dally and decide once it's started that you'd like to join in, you will be able to access the classes that were previously recorded. So for more information and or to sign up, please go to aspnj.org, and that ASP is for the Astrological Society of Princeton, which is sponsoring this class. So it's aspnj for New Jersey.org. And if you have any questions or concerns or, whatever, just email me at Sheri, Sheri, at karmicevolution.com, and I'd be happy to get back to you. And finally, I did announce last week, and I think the week before, that I'm still offering to podcast listeners only my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $99. So that's a personal reading that goes into pretty much what I just discussed about the class, right? But it's for personal for you to tell you what is your soul's purpose and true mission in this lifetime, what might have gotten you hung up or vexed, as Stephen Forrest likes to say, or taken you off your path either early in this lifetime or from past life experiences. And this can be tremendously helpful if you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back, again, in one of those major areas that most humans are concerned about: relationships, career, finances, and our personal health. Now, this particular reading on a personal level can help lead to the understanding about past wounds, what they really are, how they've affected us, and how they've affected our future behavior. And the contemplation that if we can change up that future behavior to do the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? But if we change it up, we can co-create our own future happiness and success through astrological insight. So the $99 1-hour discounted karmic evolution natal insight reading is up for everyone until January 31st of this year. After that time, I will be offering a 75-minute reading for $125. Okay. But if you're interested in grabbing that $99 discounted 1-hour reading, you can find easy access to this offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic99. All right. So let's get into this week's astro news you can use. So the big news of the week is that today, on January 12th, my mom's birthday, Mars stations direct at 8 degrees and 7 minutes of Gemini, since its retrograde motion began at 25 degrees 37 minutes of Gemini on October 30th. And I thought it would be beneficial, and I hope you can all bear with me, to look back before we go forward to better understand in this particular Mars retrograde in Gemini's period, we can better understand it through some hindsight. Now, as many of you who are regular listeners know, and she is one of my heroes, Jungian astrologer Erin Sullivan, whose book Retrograde Planets Traversing the Inner Landscape, I think is particularly brilliant because it does go into looking at retrograde planets, which, a lot of astrologers used to disregard. They didn't think much of it. Traditional astrologers, things were not going to happen during that time or slow down. But she really does an excellent job of looking at it from a Jungian psychological point of view about what's really going on in the psyche during these different retrograde periods of different planets. So she talks in her book about how the Mars retrograde period, and here I'm quoting, can either be corrosive and psychologically depleting, or it can free up frustrated energy. And one of the reasons I want to revisit this now is because, and you guys have probably heard me say this occasionally here and there also, I really believe that the value or the true value of astrology is not only looking ahead. Looking ahead is important, but I do believe that in today's society, we all just want to know what's going to happen. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week? What's going to happen? Everybody's, am I going to get married? Am I going to get the job? Am I going to move? And I'm right there with everyone. I'm no different from anyone else. I feel exactly the same way. But I think that the way that we can really make sense of our lives is when we look back, because looking back gives us a better perspective about how we might have made choices, as I've said before, that weren't really the right ones for us, for perhaps reasons. I was going to say the wrong reasons, but I don't really mean that. I mean that they're not reasons. They're reasons that come from the ego, right? I want this. I think I should have that. I deserve this, as opposed to what comes from our inner soul, which, the soul is what has or carries the wisdom of the ages. And that's something that the retrograde planets are designed to bring into consciousness. What has the soul learned? How has it become wise throughout its many, 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 many different lifetimes and many, many different experiences during those lifetimes? So when the sun opposed Mars retrograde, which after it stationed retrograde on October 30th, it opposed Mars on December 8th. And that happened to be, actually it's the 7th and the 8th. And the full moon occurred on the 7th. The Gemini full moon occurred that day. And right afterwards, the sun opposed Mars on the West Coast, right, Pacific time that night. But it opposed Mars exact on the East Coast on December 8th. And how this particular sun opposite Mars may, according to Sullivan, and here I quote, have detonated any dormant anger, frustration, or hostility. And, it's during this period, she says, that we may begin to, and again, I'm going to quote, find supporting pockets of anger during Mars retrograde, which positively clear out harbored animosity. And we might note that leading up to that date, as the Sagittarius sun was waxing towards its exact opposition to Mars, just after, as I said, the Gemini full moon perfected on December 7th, that there were several occurrences in the news that got our attention. And the first I'll point out is that on December 4th, which clearly was 3 days or so before, and you all guys also know, the energies of the aspects formed by planets is strongest as they're waxing. And the degree the degrees between the waxing period and the actual perfection of an aspect, how much occurs during that time is really a matter of observation correlation, as they would say in the scientific realm, right? I've noticed that a lot of things do occur within a couple of days before a perfected aspect. It depends on whether we're dealing with an outer planet, which is extremely slow moving, or a faster moving planet. So perhaps a faster moving planet is going to make its presence felt closer to the actual aspect, whereas a slower moving planet, maybe it's going to be a week or 10 days before. It just depends. So I would call everyone to just sort of pay attention to their own lives and to looking at the explanation of some of these aspects, and just to look back and see when something might have occurred in your particular life that makes sense based on the interpretation of a particular aspect. So on December 4th, even though the sun opposed Mars exact late on the 7th and early on the 8th, former President Donald Trump called for the termination of the Constitution in one of his Truth Social posts. Now, I want everyone to pay attention to the actual vocabulary here, right? Mars is the war god. Mars wants to take things that it wants. It wants its way. It's an ego planet. I don't care what you want to do. I want to do this. So in addition to being correlated with the personal will, proactivity, making choices, and moving instinctually, it's related to ambition and motivation. But when it crosses that line, it can become violent. It can become uber sexual. Mars, and it's as it rules the planet. I'm sorry, rules the sign of Aries, is male sexuality. But when taken to an extreme, we get sexual, rape and sexual assault and things of that nature. So uber aggression, uber or hypersexuality, and violence are the dark sides of Mars. And these are some of the things that we are tasked with reviewing when Mars is traveling retrograde. But in this case, so the termination, Donald Trump believes we should terminate, right? Let's just stop it in its tracks, kill it dead. And the quote that he has from his tweet is, he called for the termination of the Constitution in one of his Truth Social platform's posts, which caused U.S. House Representative Liz Cheney, who is a member of she's the co-chair, I think, of the House January 6th committee, to tweet, and here I quote, "Donald Trump believes we should terminate all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution, to overturn," again, warlike, right? The 2020, overturned by force, the 2020 election. That was his view on January 6th and remains his view today. No honest person can now deny that Trump is an enemy of the Constitution. Again, a warlike term, right? An enemy. Now, December 5th brought news that the Iranian quote-unquote morality police allegedly abolished its secret police. And according to the Wall Street Journal, this news came after weeks of anti-government protests ignited by the death of a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, Again, this is, Mars at its worst in terms of its sexuality, right? If you're not going to be subservient, oh, well, I guess we just have to kill you. So it was ignited by the death of this 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini after her arrest by the morality police, allegedly because she was wearing her hijab improperly. The state-run Al-Alam television station later pushed back on the claim that the morality police had been disbanded, according to CNN, which reported no official of the Islamic Republic of Iran has said that the guidance patrol has been shut. So, we didn't have Mercury retrograde yet until December 29th, but there's a little bit of confusion here, it's mayhem, etc., which is Mars also. And on that day, too, December 5th, the G7, which is the conglomeration of countries, including the United States and the European Union, some of the European Union nations, enforced a price cap on Russian oil. Now, for obvious reasons, since Russia attacked the Ukraine, and these countries didn't want Russia to be able to make money on its oil. On that day, too, China continued to relax its zero COVID tolerance policy begun in November. And the U.S. reported a rise in COVID cases post-Thanksgiving holiday. Now, some of you may remember that I was talking about some of these lunations. The past two lunations had the goddess asteroid Hygeia figured prominently. The Capricorn new moon had Hygeia conjuncted, so that there's still obviously a lot of talk about health in the air. Especially related to the COVID-19 and new variants and things like that. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, on December 7th, back to Donald Trump, the Trump Organization was found guilty of tax fraud. Ralph Warnock was reelected senator of Georgia after defeating Herschel Walker in a runoff election, a mini war, right? I shouldn't say war. I should say a competition, but that fits Mars energy too. And this was during Mars retrograde when we had a similar runoff 2 years before, or was it was in 2021. Yeah, a year and a half before. So, well, almost 2 years before. But anyway, pretty interesting, right? On that day, too, Iranian drones struck targets inside Russia by several hundred miles from the Ukrainian border for the second day. So the first time was December 6th, the second one December 7th, and that's the first time, or one of the first times, that Ukraine retaliated in a way that actually harmed those on Russian soil, right? So that's the big piece of information for that. And also on December 7th, which of course in the United States was Pearl Harbor Day, right? December 7th is a day that will live in infamy when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii. But this year, or 2022, Germany detained 25 people in an alleged plot to overthrow the government there. I can't get more martial than that, right? In addition, Representative Bernie Thompson, who's a Democrat from Mississippi and chair of the House January 6th committee, announced that members of the panel had reached a general agreement on making criminal referrals to the Justice Department. Again, vocabulary, criminal. And as befits its martial theme, that waxing Sun-Mars retrograde opposition saw a federal judge rule that Oregon's ban on high-capacity magazines could take effect, but hours later, a state circuit judge blocked the new gun law, and the law would ban the manufacture, purchase, or sale of magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition, and would require prospective gun buyers to take a safety course and pass a background check to get a permit for their firearm purchase. It also would close the quote-unquote Charleston loophole in federal law, which allows people to get newly purchased guns after 3 days if a background check hasn't been completed. Harney County Circuit Court Judge Robert Rashio said the law, Measure 114, would violate the state constitution by leaving people, quote, unable to lawfully purchase a firearm or bear a magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition in Oregon. So first, the federal judge ruled that the ban on the high-capacity magazines could take effect, meaning that Oregon could ban that. But then hours later, a state circuit judge blocked the ban, which means that it is you are able to lawfully purchase a firearm or bear a magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition right now. At least that's the supposition, right? So again, you can't get more martial than guns, right? On December 8th, after the Gemini full moon and the Sun-Mars retrograde opposition had perfected, Peru's president was, according to the Associated Press, and here I quote, ousted after trying to dissolve Congress and after Peruvian lawmakers rejected President Pedro Castillo's decree dissolving Congress. Does that sound familiar at all? Let's abolish the Constitution. And voted to remove him from office and replace him with the Andean nation's Vice President Dina Boluarte. Castillo's move aimed to head off lawmakers' previously scheduled third attempt to impeach him, again, echoes of the United States, accusing him of a permanent moral incapacity to rule the South American country. The embattled leftist president had named an emergency government and called for special elections to pick new legislators, saying in a televised address that he would lead by decree in the meantime. He also ordered a nightly curfew starting Wednesday. So, I mean, again, a curfew, right? You're restricted. Martial law. Boluarte accused Castillo of an attempted coup, and Castillo was arrested after his ouster. Now, on December 9th, many of us may recall, though I didn't specifically recall the date, that Russia freed WNBA star Brittany Grimes, basketball star, in exchange for a notorious Russian, guess what, people, arms dealer who had been convicted and jailed in the United States. And the House approved a same-sex marriage bill along bipartisan lines. Sex, anyone? And former President Donald Trump's legal effort to have an outside special master review documents the FBI had seized in a search of his Florida home, Mar-a-Lago, ended when he declined to appeal a decision dismissing the lawsuit. And just for some background, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals shut down the suit the week before, but gave Trump a week to appeal. So legal experts had said Trump's legal team had little chance of overturning the ruling, but the decision not to appeal still surprised observers. A Trump advisor previously said the former president's strategy was to appeal everything to the Supreme Court. Remember, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices during his administration and assumed that they would be, quote unquote, in his pocket. But the ending of the lawsuit cleared the way for the Justice Department to obtain the bulk of documents collected in the search. And all of that was according to NBC News. So if between October 30th, when Mars stationed retrograde, and this week we felt disorganized or chaotic, Mars retrograde is known for creating emotional turmoil and internal riots, according to Aaron Sullivan. So one of the results during this period may well have been depression, which normally equated with Saturn, is also a Mars function, Sullivan notes. And here I quote from her: melancholy is a black anger from the Greek kolos, the bile which chemically activates anger. And when Mars is transiting retrograde, it's an ideal time to determine the difference between depression of the senses or psychic apathy and simple lack of interest. That's, again, this is direct quote from Retrograde Planets by Sullivan, and she continues, to press on in a situation which appears fruitless is sheer bloody-mindedness, not brave assertiveness. It might be appropriate, therefore, to relinquish a once beloved project, attitude, relationship, or goal rather than persist aggressively in outmoded activities once Mars completes its retrograde cycle. And I think some of what we've been seeing here is appropriate to that, or what I've been talking about. Now, I'd like to point out too, and she has this elsewhere in her writing, that when Mars is retrograde, and I've mentioned this, I know, numerous times on this podcast. My podcast has been around for, gosh, it's in March, I think it's going to be 6 years. It started in 2017, I believe. So, 2023. Anyway, that when Mars is retrograde, it's time for us to find, or locate, and activate, which would mean bring into consciousness our inner warrior. So there's an awakening possible when Mars is retrograde. And much of what Sullivan is pointing out here is some of the process of that awakening, right? So, but she's also equating it to the outside world and what our interests are, or were, and what they will be after Mars stations direct. So what we thought we wanted to achieve, what we thought we had ambition and motivation for, might have gone underground during the Mars retrograde period, which might have resulted in a kind of depression, as she says. But the depression always has its purpose because it slows us down. And she's saying that it's a time for us now to look back and say, well, were we really depressed, or do we just become kind of deflated because we realize we actually no longer have the same interest in certain accomplishments, or, in gaining certain accomplishments, than we did before? And if that's the case, the whole point of the Mars retrograde, once it stations direct, is to let go of our previous ambition or motivation for something, a particular goal, and to focus on something else. Now, she also mentions illness, and she says if one becomes ill during Mars retrograde period, according to her, such, quote, illness can redress an imbalance of energy by forcing one to retire and contemplate one's direction and use of energy, whether that be passion, will, or ambition. Now, she points out that, usually depression is related to transits of Saturn, but that Mars is more related to acute illness rather than chronic illness. So something that comes on suddenly. Mars, oftentimes when we're stopped in our tracks, or stymied in some way and frustrated, that can be a Saturn transit, which is telling us that, we need to reevaluate, and that perhaps something has to leave our lives because it's no longer important for us or instrumental to our future growth. And when I say future growth, of course, I mean future growth in consciousness. So Mars is sort of like a mini Saturn in this respect, but as she's saying, related to acute illness, which comes and goes more quickly, but like Saturn, can force us to retire, right? We have to stop doing what we were doing when we're ill. We can't, we don't have the same presence of mind, or we don't have the same energy, or whatever, as she says, the passion, will, or ambition. So that can cause us to reevaluate. It's just in a shorter time period, because Mars retrograde period, of course, is 2.5 months, and Saturn's more like 4.5, 5 months. So let's fast forward now to today, when Mars stations direct. Excuse me. Here's what Sullivan says about this period between Mars station direct and when the Sun trines Mars, which is going to occur on January 29th. And I quote, "The period between the station direct of Mars and the subsequent solar trine is marked by tense apprehension. The intuitive function is running high, and one instinctively knows that a situation, circumstance, or condition is unsustainable and that an overt radical change must take place. Hang on, I'm going to take a sip of my water because I got a little scratch in my throat. Hold on. Okay, that's better. Thank you. All right, and she continues by saying inspiration often goes underground during Mars retrograde, only to resurface upon the direction of Mars with a new and more realistic goal. It's as if the battle between the conscious and unconscious intent needs to take place in extreme private and secrecy, revealing itself only between the conscious self and the unconscious self, that mysterious aspect of the psyche which contains the power to direct one's life force. And she continues, a self-regulatory device is triggered off in the psyche, and the system will organize around the problem to protect itself, often solving the difficulty in the unconscious. The inner self often alerts one to an invisible yet threatening potential in one's psyche or environment. And I suppose that we could interpret that to mean that there's in the unconscious, again, which is more related to, it's related to two things, right? One is what I mentioned before, which is the program that unconsciously runs us. The behaviors and patterns of behaviors which we've been conditioned to perform or believe in or repeat based on old experiences and fears and things like that, right? Well, I can't color outside the lines because then I'll get in trouble, you know? And the point of finding the inner warrior is to say, wait a minute, who told me that? And why did I believe it? And what does my soul truly believe? So the inner self is sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, is this dangerous or is it not? Is the danger something that others have either fabricated or feared themselves and then expressed and taught that fear to me? So am I really that afraid, or can I muster up the energy, the motivation, and the will to make a different decision and a different choice and to go forward and see what happens then, right? So in other words, what she's saying here is the connection of the unconscious to the conscious by awakening the unconscious to the fact that maybe it's been running a program that's got some, I don't know, glitches in it. I don't know anymore what they call software when it's got, I guess it's got a virus or something. I don't know, but I don't think it's as serious as that. But you know what I mean? It's like, gee, I've made these assumptions for years, and now what if they're not really true? Do I have the guts and the balls to actually say, wow, well, if it's not true, maybe I can do this, and I don't have to be fearful. So as we approach the Mars station direct today, January 12th, as it's been waxing to a halt and a turnaround, because remember, the planet slows down for at least a couple of days before it stations and appears to be stationary and then appears to be moving forward again. Let's look at what's been going on this past week, especially since we've still got Mercury retrograde in Capricorn. And as I've previously pointed out, Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, the sign through which Mars has been transiting. Now, I also want to relate what I said to the Mars retrograde and what Aaron Sullivan has said about connecting the unconscious to the conscious. That's always the case with Mercury, and we know that Mercury moves much faster than Mars. It takes 88 days to revolve around the sun, and its retrograde periods are between 3 and 4 times in an annual calendar year, and that Mercury is the messenger. So when Mercury stations retrograde, the more esoteric, the more spiritual purpose of it is not to cause us to lose our cell phone, not to cause us to miss appointments, not to cause us to forget our plane tickets, or I mean, now there's less of that unless you like lost your phone, right? Paper tickets and stuff like that, not to miss phone calls, not to lose emails and all these things that are related to electronics, not to fear signing contracts or making big purchases, although one should be aware of that. That point is that we need to look at the small print or the fine print in any contract or agreement, because we may be more prone to overlooking those details when Mercury's retrograde. And the reason for that is because Mercury, the messenger in Greek mythology, he moved between Mount Olympus, Earth, and the underworld. He was the only god who could traverse those three realms without, penalty, right? Because if you went into the underworld, you really generally didn't come back. There are a few myths about coming back, but they're rare, right? Persephone and what's his name? The musician, I forgot his name, who was it Orestes? No, it's not Orestes. The one who invented the lyre and who played the most beautiful music, and then he got out, but he wasn't supposed to turn around because he went to rescue his wife, and they allowed him to take her back to Earth, but they told him he cannot turn back to look at her until they get out of the underworld and onto the Earth plane. And he does, and she disappears. And that was probably the precursor to the Judaic Christian Old Testament story about Lot and his wife, who turns into a pillar of salt, right? Because he turns around to look at her. So in any case, I wasn't really planning on going off into that tangent, but you get my point that Mercury's the messenger who can deliver messages from on high. Mount Olympus, our higher consciousness, Earth, our empirical consciousness, and the underworld, which is our unconscious or subconscious, okay? So since he can do that, what happens when he's retrograde is the external ability for him to send and receive messages on the empirical plane, let's just call that Earth, right? The physical plane, becomes stymied because he's busy going down into the underworld of the unconscious or the subconscious to pull out things that we've learned through the ages, meaning through different lifetimes, that we would now call pieces of wisdom from our soul, to bring them into our higher consciousness, our esoteric brains, so that we can become wiser. And at the same time, his mission is to take education, things that we've learned empirically, like sitting in a classroom or reading in a book or observing human nature, and to bring that down into the subconscious portion of the psyche and there embed it as future soul wisdom. So he's so busy going back and forth during these approximately 21, 22 days, approximately 3 to 4 times a year, that we get confused. We lose our keys. We forget where we parked our car. We, get 3 messages, but they don't show up on our phone until 3 days later. The computer, I mean, I can't tell you how many people, you've seen it on Facebook or Instagram or any other ways that you communicate with people that, oh no, I had technical problems, oh no, I lost my phone. I mean, the losing of the phone is like classic in this day and age. But computer programs, electrical problems in the house, It's funny that they just came out with a story today that I think it's out of the Biden administration, talking about the fact that the gas stove is on its way out because gas stoves are no good for the climate, and that they've been now proven to exacerbate asthma and medical issues like that. And my ex, who was here with my son last night for dinner, was telling me that, and he's an Aquarian midheaven, that they're looking at magnets that can create heat but not feel hot. So in other words, your stove wouldn't be gas run, it would be magnetized. And if you touched the magnets, you wouldn't get burned. But if you put a pot on top of it, it would boil water. So, Uranus, progress, all that makes kind of sense. And that this is at least 10 or more years away. There's also stuff today about, I think it's one of the safety transportation people in the government objecting to larger SUVs and others that are electric cars, because the cars themselves, with the additional weight of the battery, which can cause a battery in an electric car like an SUV or a Hummer or something can weigh like 3,000 pounds, but that the extra weight of these vehicles will cause more deaths on the highway, because clearly it's like Bambi meets Godzilla, right? It's like, you crash into a little, a smaller car. I can't, I'm going back in the ages in my head, like a VW Bug, right? If a Hummer, an electric Hummer, which is now like 10,000 pounds heavier than the regular Hummer, right? Then you're getting annihilated by it. So, there are things to watch out for. But these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about in relationship. I just went off on a little tangent, so forgive me. But in relationship to electronics and Mercury. But in addition, right now, to the issues on the front burner in schools, which are related to, Mars and Gemini, right? Mercury-ruled Gemini has been related to the alleged teaching on lower levels of the critical race theory, which is not actually happening, but the accusations are being made, and the push to ban books and sports that allow books that have as its subject matter, and sports that allow the participation of LGBTQ students. This is sort of part of Mars in Gemini and Mars retrograde in Gemini, while Mercury's been in Capricorn and retrograde in Capricorn, like that, these whole periods, right? There's obviously been, for many years now, the discussion of arming teachers due to the amount of mass shootings in schools around America. And I just want to point out that as Mars also was stationing, right, beginning to slow down for his station direct today, even though it was a full 6 days ago, on January 6th, the first grader student removed his mother's registered gun, so it was a legal weapon, from his backpack and shot his teacher in the chest. Now, she survived, but was at first in critical condition and is now stabilized, but I'm not sure if she's still considered critical or not. And they credit with her at the school with having ushered the rest of the class out of the room quickly, as someone who was employed by the school, I'm not quite sure who, rushed in to restrain the child who dropped the gun. Now, according to the Associated Press, this occurred in Newport News, Virginia, at an elementary school. And the Newport News mayor, Philip Jones, said, "This is a red flag for the country. I do think that after this event, there is going to be a nationwide discussion on how these sorts of things can be prevented." So again, I think we're seeing the overlap of the Mars station direct a few days before Mercury is due to station direct on January 18th. Now, on January 9th, which is only 3 days before Mars station, according to the New York Times, and here I quote, "Thousands of supporters of far-right former Brazilian President Jair, I'm not sure how to pronounce his first name, Bolsonaro, stormed the South American nation's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential offices on Sunday in an explosion of anger fueled by false allegations that Bolsonaro was ousted in a stolen election. Oh no, I'm like Herschel Walker. Shit. Stolen election. That's because Mars is involved. I was going to say, I call it the copycat insurrection. Anyway, the Times goes on to say security forces arrested at least 200. Actually, this was early on. They've arrested over 1,500 people. and cleared out the last rioters. Brazil's newly sworn-in president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, beat Bolsonaro in a close October vote. And Lula said Bolsonaro's refusal to accept the results as legitimate triggered the riot. Again, martial language, which was reminiscent of the January 6, 2020 attack on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of former President Donald Trump, who falsely claimed the 2020 U.S. presidential election was stolen from Trump, right? So GOP, this is another, again, as we get close to the station, right, with the assessment that things will start to realign themselves with either new goals or, pursuing certain goals, but maybe honing in more specifically on certain topics. And GOP-controlled House to launch panel to investigate FBI was the headline out of the New York Times on that day, too, which wrote, and I quote, "The House, now controlled by Republicans, is expected to vote this week on creating a special judiciary subcommittee to investigate the FBI and national security agencies and what lawmakers call the," and here I'm quoting, "weaponization of the federal government." Again, weaponization. And this is from the Washington Post. New coronavirus variant, most transmissible yet, dominates in parts of the U.S., while reporting also on January 10th that China's suffering some 5,000 COVID deaths a day in brutal surge. Now, I also want to mention that although it was a full 10 days before today's Mars Station Direct, then on January 2nd, the Buffalo Bills football NFL player Damar Hamlin suffered a cardiac arrest after being hit by an opposing player on the Cincinnati Bengals. And this would seem to fit with Aaron Sullivan's assessment of illness surfacing during the Mars, acute illness, right? During the Mars retrograde period. I mean, he wasn't known to have any heart ailments, along with his recovery and release from Cincinnati's ICU and his transfer to Buffalo General Hospital on January 9th, just days before Mars Station. Now, as I said, Brazilian security forces continued detaining supporters of former President Bolsonaro on January 9th, too, after the mob of them stormed the South American Nations Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidential palace a day earlier. And the Wall Street Journal reported, and here I quote, "The mob was fueled by Bolsonaro's false allegations that he was ousted through fraud in last year's election. And the government of Lula called the riot an attempt to overthrow the newly elected leader. Monday's arrest brought the number of people detained over the incident to about 1,500. Now, they're saying that the government there, because the police were involved on behalf of the government immediately, rounded up people immediately, which was not what happened in the U.S. on January 6th of 2021. But it says the election between Lula, a standard bearer of the Latin American left, and the far-right Bolsonaro, sometimes referred to as the tropical Trump, was the closest in Brazil's history. Now, we also had the news that on January 10th, 2 days ago, classified documents were found in President Biden's old office from when he was vice president, presumably strengthening the GOP's resolve to attack him further, as well as motivating them to bring their threatened impeachment charges against him since they've regained their House majority, albeit a slim one. So again, they're gearing up, right? It's like whether you're fabricating these things or whether you're making new plans, obviously Kevin McCarthy became speaker. The House dominated the GOP has dominated the House since the elections, and Mars went retrograde October 30th. So a lot of this whole stuff has come up between then and now in terms of their plans for the future. And a Georgia grand jury on January 10th also finished its 8-month Fulton County special grand jury investigation into whether former President Donald Trump and his allies committed any crimes in their attempt to reverse Trump's 2020 election loss in the state. They absolved the grand jury, and there's a hearing now on January 24th where prosecutors, the news media, and targets of the investigation will have a chance to argue whether the grand jury's report should be made public. And the district attorney there, Fannie Willis, will decide whether to charge anyone based on the grand jury's work. And that's according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So again, I think the other big piece of news that happened within the last 2 days is that Catholic Cardinal Pell, who was jailed and then acquitted of sex abuse, has passed away at the age of 81. So he was the highest ranking Catholic prelate ever charged with sexually abusing children. And he died in Rome at the age of 81. But he was convicted, spent a year in solitary confinement, but his conviction was overturned by a top Australian court in 2020. And that's apparently where he was presiding or whatever. So anyway, I am coming to the end of showtime, but I just thought it was kind of important. I want to talk next week about Uranus stationing direct, which happens on the 22nd. So on the 19th, we'll talk more about that, and also, of course, about the Aquarius new moon, which is going to occur on January 21st at 1 degree 33 minutes Aquarius at 3:53 p.m. Eastern and 12:53 p.m. Pacific time. So that will be an interesting one because that's very close to the degree of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December of 2020. And of course, we have on March 23rd, Pluto moving into 0 degrees Capricorn. But the other thing I wanted to mention, because you've probably seen it around a lot in astrological news, is that as soon as these two planets, Mercury on the 18th and Uranus on the 22nd, station direct, all of the major planets will be direct. So all systems will be go now. And that will be true until Mars stations retrograde again in Venus-ruled Taurus, which won't happen until April 21st. So theoretically, it's a good time to, move forward with all of our plans, etc. So I want to thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. And please be sure to join me next week on January 19th for another episode of this podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go.